Hi, it's the OPA Hub again, and today we're going to look at input control extensions. The goal of this presentation is to give you an idea of the different elements that will need to be coded in your JavaScript file, and to give you some examples of what you might use an input control extension for. If you're interested in learning more about them, at the end of this presentation, you'll find a link to the JavaScript extensions for Oracle Policy Modeling book, or you can find some other examples on the opahub.com website. So let's start with the basics. What is a JavaScript control extension? First of all, it's exclusively designed for use with interviews, and it's a JavaScript file which lets the developer extend the basic user interface controls, so labels, buttons, calendars, and the like. And they come essentially in a set of types, and one of those types is an input control. And we would say that it has a specific type key, which allows us to identify just by looking at the code what kind of extension it is. In the previous chapter, we saw a label extension, and in this chapter, we'll talk about input extensions, and in other chapters, we'll discover all sorts of other extension type keys. So this control extension, whether it be a label or an input or anything else, essentially leverages objects and methods that are made available to us through the extension API provided by Oracle. And it's our job to code one or more event keys, and that helps us put code in the right place. For example, we make sure that the input control is painted on the page when the user arrives on the screen, and we make sure that it updates itself when something interesting happens. Because this is HTML and JavaScript based, we have to be particularly careful and play by a set of rules that are documented online as to what we should and shouldn't do. We should always make sure that our extension plays nicely with the underlying logic engine. We should not at all attempt to modify the behavior of that underlying engine. The goal of an extension, of a control extension, is not to make 2 plus 2 equal 5. It's just to show the number 4 or the numbers 2 plus 2 in a nicer or more user-friendly way. How do we get started? Well, you can write one from scratch, or you can work with a template. And on the opahub.com, we have a code generator which helps you get started by helping you generate some sample code that you can use for your experimentation or just use to save time. It's handy because it ensures that you have basic logging and that you have all the basic event keys in your code. So let's go and have a look at how that might work for an input extension. So I've fired up the code generator. I'm going to accept the terms and conditions, and I will choose a custom input and click Next. There are various basic options. The key one, which we discussed last time around, is essentially creating a custom property for the control on the screen so that our code only executes whenever we need it to execute. With an input control, however, there's a couple of other things we need to provide. We need to provide the ID of an HTML input tag, that would be the simplest, and of course we need to provide the attribute. So we need to provide the public name of the attribute that we're going to bind this input control to. Now I haven't created my project yet, but let's imagine I have a global attribute called this. And as we mentioned just a moment ago, there are two new event keys in the custom input, and that's the validate and the update. So we're going to add some sample code to those two event keys to see how they work. So we've generated our code, and you can see clearly from the example that we have a slightly longer structure than we did with the label control. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard. And just before we go and use it, so you can see we have the mount and unmount, which we have in the vast majority of control extensions. And we have the two new ones. We have the update and the validate, which we'll discuss in a little while. So now that I've copied the code into the clipboard, I'm going to go ahead and use it in a brand new project. So I've created a brand new project in Oracle Policy Modeling, and I'm going to go straight away, I'll make it full screen, I'm going to go straight away into my Rules tab, and into my Data tab, I'm going to create an attribute, and I'm going to make sure that I don't forget, for the basis of this demo, to give the attribute a public name that corresponds to the one that I used when I generated my code. Okay, that done, I can proceed to the Interview tab, and let's create a new screen just for the sake of keeping it nice and tidy. And we'll say that this is our input extension, and we'll add a new input control. So now that we have our input control on the screen, just like before, we're going to add a custom property, which we also referenced in the JavaScript code, to ensure that if we put other inputs on this page, our code will only execute for that one. Now we'll go ahead and go into the Styles dialog, go through the steps to create the folder so I can add a custom file, and that's going to be my custom JavaScript file. So I'll create a custom text file and I'll end up renaming it and changing the extension. Yep, just so that I can open it up and paste in my code. So now that we've pasted it in, let's spend a few moments to just review what we've got. We've got a reference to the custom property, and we have a mount section which is going to insert an HTML input tag, as well as a get value to record the value if there is one already in the attribute. Let's click OK and come out of there. And let's just test drive our attribute, our input control extension. And then we'll go back and look at the code in a little more detail. So there's our extension. I'll make it a bit bigger, and you'll notice that the extension is in fact an input tag, and it has a background color. I'm going to type in it now, and I'm going to click Next. You'll notice that what I typed has caused a validation error, but when I type the correct value, I can proceed. You'll also probably notice that the background color of the control is changing, and that's because there's an update event key also in there. As long as I keep trying and as long as I keep triggering the update, you'll see the background color changing. And it's important for you to realize that the background color changes when the update key fires, but the update key fire could be firing because of something else that's happening in the interview. The update key basically means anything happening in the interview. So you will have noticed that I had some color changes even when I was just clicking the next button, because that was triggering the update on my control. So here I have another attribute without the custom property. So the other attribute is now editable, but you'll also notice that my extension is also changing color because the update key is still firing. Again, this is just trying to highlight the fact that the update key fires when anything is updated in the interview. It's not specifically linked to your control extension. Incidentally, the demo code just chooses a random color. You can obviously change that to whatever you want, or do whatever updates you might need, such as refreshing a calculated value or changing the font size because the value got too high, or whatever it is. But that's what your update key is for. Now let's move on to the validate key. The validate key operates on a simple principle. Any validation rule that you provide has to either return true or false. So if it's a correct validation, then it returns true or it returns false. Optionally, you can return a string, which means it's false and your string is the error message. There are actually two kinds of input extension. The custom input that we've just talked about, and the full custom input. There's a very simple difference. In the custom input, you need to, in your JavaScript code, take care of the entry control. So in our example, it was an input tag. In a full custom input, you need to take care of not only the input tag, but also the question text, so the label that will accompany your input tag. Here's a quick example so you can see the difference between the two. So here we are back in our code generator, and we'll choose this time full custom input and see what the difference is. As before, we would create a custom property, and let's call this x full custom input. Of course, the name is entirely up to you. And so not only will we need to provide the attribute for binding, just like we did before, but this time around we have to provide two HTML tags as a basic starting point. We would need something that will be the label for the question. I'm just using this as a name, as an ID, and this would be the actual input tag, if you will. And we'll include a demonstration validate and update, just like before. So now when we look at this, you'll see that it's exceedingly similar. The only real difference is that in the mount, we create a span, and it's the span that will use the control.getCaption to display whatever the question caption is. And then we have our traditional input tag, which will display any existing value. So in a sense, we've got two elements that we need to mount in our mount key. Otherwise, the user will see only an input box and won't know what the question is. That's the difference. So we've discussed the fact that there are two basic input extensions, and that no matter which version you choose, they have four basic event keys: mount and unmount, which we've seen previously in labels, and update and validate. Update is fired when anything in the interview has changed. So it could be the user is entering data in another control on your screen, or is clicking a button on your screen, or something else has triggered an update. We also looked at the validate event key, where we validate what the user has entered in your input extension. And it's a simple true-false idea. If whatever the user has entered meets your criteria, then you can return true. And if it doesn't meet what you want, you return false. Or as an optional, and I would say not really optional, but more mandatory approach, you can simply provide a text string, which becomes the error message, and the false is implicit. So beyond the basic idea of an input tag, what is an input in Intelligent Advisor? It could really be anything that lets the user communicate with the interview to provide a value. So it could be something as an input tag that you type into, or it could be something super complicated like an image, a clickable image of a human body to select an area of injury, or a tattoo, or it could be something between the two extremes. It could be something like an input tag, but with a little bit extra to make it easy, or a little bit of something to make it a bit more friendly. What matters to us, we who are designing the input extension, is we basically have to handle the user editing data. We need to therefore bind our input control extension to an attribute. We need to make sure that when we finish, we transfer any new value into the attribute. We need to handle loading any existing value and handling default values, as well as we've seen handling validation rules. So an input tag is generally a good start, but we should bear in mind that since the Intelligent Advisor API is agnostic, couldn't care less what our element is, as long as we handle the event keys, the update, the validate, the mount, and the unmount, it could essentially be an image, or anything that better represents your data, some sort of checkbox, a calendar. These are all valid input controls, and they correspond to standard input controls that you've seen in interviews hundreds of times, but you could choose to do them slightly differently. You could use a different calendar control. You could use icons in your checkbox. You could even use an external component. So you could go and hunt in the JS query library of plugins and find what you want. Whatever it is, ultimately, you just need to make sure that your mount, unmount, validate, and update do what we need to do, that we recognize values entered by the user and we make sure that they are bound to the attribute. So let's take a look at some examples. The first one we're going to look at is a commonly found one with complex data entry. What I mean by that is where you have some formatting or some mask. A good example would be that phone numbers typically have a structure that is country dependent. The number of digits, for example, whether or not you include parentheses around the area code. These are all fairly standard input control concepts. So you might go onto the internet and find that there's many libraries helping you enter phone numbers. In this particular example, what's also interesting is that the code operates at an entity attribute level. So they'll be setting values and ensuring that the values go to the correct entity instance. As a general note, remember that you should use Control F5 to debug in a real browser, because if you're manipulating with jQuery, you can get strange effects in the debugger. So I'm going to create a new entity instance and type in a name, and you'll see that there are 3 telephone numbers that need to be provided. you'll notice that the format has been changed slightly from the default. And of course, the other obvious thing is that you can choose a country code using the dropdown. So I'll put in a second user, put in another number, a whole bunch of numbers in fact. We have Batman and Robin, and we'll go and look at the data tab, and we'll see that we have correctly saved the data for each of the instances of the entity. So switching over to our code for a second, the key for that one to work, aside from the obvious need to implement some external library code, is to ensure that we use control.instance and control.entity whenever we're taking care, for example, of setting a value. So up here we have, for example, set input value, and we're setting one of the values and we're using control.entity and control.instance. So an important feature of that example was ensuring that you were using set input value and handling control.instance and control.entity. So in your extension, you actually have access to the control object and the control instance and control entity properties. So there's not much you have to do except just to remember to include them in your set input value. Of course, if you're doing things over multiple runs, such as multiple instances of an entity, ensure that you're not loading or reloading code libraries multiple times. This would be, for example, if you are displaying a map per entity instance. With Google Maps will clearly give you an error message in the console if you attempt to load the library twice. So make sure that you handle that correctly. So we know from our Intelligent Advisor training that within the attribute definition, there's something called a validation message, and you can set up a simple validation, for example, a minimum and a maximum value if it's a number, or if it's a text string, you can include a regular expression. But that has significant limitations, and in real life, attributes may require complex custom validation that isn't achievable directly in Word or Excel rules, because maybe it uses a algorithm, or it requires to iterate over every character in the attribute. A good one would be a famous algorithm that is used to, for example, check the validity of discount coupons, or indeed in some countries is used to verify the format of a company registration number. Let's take a look at that. So this example uses an algorithm which is actually in the public domain. It's used for validating, amongst other things, fast food coupons, but also French national company identifiers. So you can see that I have various tests here. I'm playing with different numbers and getting a validation error that's in my validation event key. But when I enter a valid number, which identifies a company in France, I pass the validation test. Now, this particular validation, it was actually written in JavaScript by somebody else and is available on the internet. So once we've seen that the data has been correctly saved in the attribute, we can go over and have a look at the actual code in our JavaScript extension file. So in this example code, you'll see it's a very standard structure for an input extension. In the mount, you'll notice that as before, we're using entity.instance because I need to get the value of the correct entity instance. There may be multiple companies on this screen. So it's what worked for set input value also works for get value. And you can see that there's an if statement here that says if check loon, and then there's a validation message if things go wrong. And the actual code of the function is to be found at the bottom of the page. In this next example, we're using a completely external setup, meaning that we're going to use external code components, in this case, Google Maps to provide a visual map, and also Google Places API to perform some kind of search on the data. In a sense, we're outsourcing almost everything. We still need to handle, of course, the update and validate, and we still need to mount and unmount our visual effects. But all the other events, such as the user clicking on the map or the user making a search for something, is all handled within the external code. So it's an example of kind of how far you can go to present a custom user interface, and what really matters is how you then map it back to your attributes at the end so that your interview is updated correctly. So in this example, this is an initial screen with a standard control, and now we have the input extension. The Google map is itself the input extension. The user can interact with the map, drag and drop the marker to specify their location, and their location is then reverse geocoded to provide an address, and also, of course, we're able to identify the latitude and longitude. From that, we can then provide a list of resources, for example, breakdown garages near their current location. It's an example of how far you can go to transform an input extension, in the sense that the vast majority of the code in here will be handling the interaction with Google Maps and the interaction, for example, with the Google Map marker. There you'll find in here there's a Google Map marker click, there's also a Google Map marker drag end, and really when it comes to interacting with our input extension, it's a very small piece of code to make sure that we update, for example, the address or the latitude and longitude, or even the chosen garage as our input data. The rest is essentially handling the advanced interaction with the user, and it completely transforms how users interact with our interview. In this final example, we're trying to show that an input extension is often a combination of many things. In this particular scenario, the input extension is using a jQuery UI plugin, the date picker, but it's also using an Intelligent Advisor entity with several instances which provide the data for the calendar. So we're using and leveraging the power of Intelligent Advisor entities. We're not hard coding anything in the JavaScript. And in addition, we're using the validation event key to display custom error messages based on the data provided by Intelligent Advisor. So you might recognize this as one of the example projects from Oracle Policy Modeling. So we've extended it slightly to include a date picker, and you'll notice that within the date picker, certain dates are marked as being unavailable for whatever reason, whether they be company holidays, national holidays, or some other thing. And we've changed the color display to make it obvious to the end user. If they insist on choosing a date that is not available, when they decide to click next, they will receive a custom validation message which reminds them of the reason why. So what does this mean? It means that in our input extension, clearly we've had to load a jQuery UI plugin, but we've also loaded some instance data from the project itself, because those red and green dates are actually coming from an inferred entity within our project. We don't want to hard code anything in our JavaScript. We want to make it as reusable as possible. And then we're going to handle highlighting and formatting the different values with a different class so the user knows which ones are green and which ones are red. And here's an example of a very simple class to color them in accordingly. If we go to our project itself and we go over to our screen, we'll see that our date input is a standard date control with a standard custom property, but we've also included a second custom property so that we know which entity we are going to use to retrieve the dates from. And this entity is actually, for the sake of this demo, a simple set of inferred instances, and they are what are being read into the calendar at runtime, which provides a very nice effect. The second example from this particular project involves these radio buttons. You'll notice that the radio buttons have also got a custom property attached, and that when we run our project, the custom radio buttons are actually using a nice set of icons instead of the standard radio buttons. And you'll see that we've included logic to load the icons, but also select the correct icon depending on the default or the existing value, and to swap in and out whichever of the icons is the right one to show according to the value. Again, this is a standard input extension control, just using custom icons and using some click events to make sure that the right value is shown and the update is made of the bound interview attribute. At runtime, it looks a little bit like this. where we see our custom icons, and we must check always that whatever we implement for our input extension doesn't stop the rest of the interview functioning. You'll notice that there's actually a visibility rule which hides a control based on that. The third and final example of a custom extension for an input that we're going to look at in here involves the name attribute, which is just above the radio buttons. We're going to examine the contents of the name field, and we're going to use it to identify how many lowercase, how many uppercase, how many numerics, and how many non-alphanumerics you have in your string in order to, for example, analyze the total content of the string and decide whether what you have entered is a valid name or not. So it's an example again of using the validation key, and this time using a slightly more sophisticated approach because we actually display the details underneath the entry. You can see that there are 3 caps, 3 lowers, so we consider that for us that's too many capital letters. It's a good example of how even a simple input control can have a marked effect on data quality if it is coupled with a validation event key. So hopefully this short presentation has given you an idea of how flexible and powerful input extensions can be. They require in most cases that the events relating to the user interface of the input, the click, the drag, and so on, are handled in what we'll call pure JavaScript or jQuery, as opposed to intelligent advisor-oriented JavaScript or jQuery. But we always need to make sure that whatever we do in terms of visual effect, that there's sufficient binding in the mount to ensure that existing values are displayed, in the update and the validate to ensure that values are redisplayed when they're updated or are validated correctly, and handed off to the interview in the unmount to make sure that essentially the values are maintained in the attribute or attributes. We've seen that validations can be simplistic or can hand off to complex algorithms or can hand off to tremendously sophisticated user interface examples that use external libraries or external elements. But ultimately, what it boils down to is your input extension can handle 4 event keys: mount, unmount, validate, and update. And whatever you do, you should make sure that you're not interfering with the rules engine, the logic engine of Intelligent Advisor. Other than that, you're free to make your extension as complex or as simple as it need be. I hope you enjoyed this little training session, and I look forward to seeing you on theopahub.com.